So what I'm going to try to do for you guys today is, I don't know if, has anybody ever been to an Agile and Beyond before? Like a lot of times I've come here and I've had like an hour and 40 minutes to speak. And I'm like, how am I going to fill an hour and 40 minutes? Today I've got 45 minutes. So we're getting like the abridged version of some of this stuff. But what I'm doing here is I'm going to try to explore telling my story. If anybody's ever seen my story, I'm going to try to tell it a little bit tighter. And I'm going to try to tell it a little bit different and focus on some different things, because I'm getting ready to repackage some of this stuff for Agile 2019, because I'm going to do the transformation talk up in DC at the Agile conference up there. So I'm trying on some things, so I'm going to experiment with you guys just a little bit here today. But one of the big things that I want to get across to you guys, this is my contact information if anybody needs it, but one of the things that I want to get across to you guys today is that getting folks to adopt Agile is really fundamentally kind of a change management activity. Okay? And while everything that you guys told me about what makes it difficult to adopt Agile and to make use of Agile methodologies, all of that stuff is totally legit and all of that stuff is totally real. The question that you have to ask yourself is, how do you overcome it? Is that a fair question? Because you just can't like beat people with a stick and say, you need to have an Agile culture, or you need to be less fear of failing. You need to be less command and control. Because a lot of times, you guys might have a unique situation where the teams were able to commit when they were left alone. But a lot of managers have a history where they've empowered their teams to do Agile, and they didn't deliver anything. Right? And that's pretty risky from a manager's perspective. So if I'm the leader of an organization and I want to try to figure out how to help my organization move forward, then I've got to give them a framework for creating safety while they move forward. Is that a reasonable hypothesis? And so the next slide basically says, and this is when I kind of do the full-blown talk, what I started to distinguish was this idea of the talk is about getting people to move. It's not about getting them to learn Agile. I mean, you guys, everybody in here, everybody's probably got their CSM. Everybody knows how to do Scrum. It's not rocket science, right? It's not hard. But it is so hard. Right? It's hard to get it done. So what we have to do is we have to transform the organization into the kind of organization that can do Agile. And so we have to get people moving, and we have to keep them moving over time. We have to build momentum, and we have to sustain momentum. And one of the things that we find ourselves talking about a lot is distinguishing what we call a system of delivery from the system of transformation. And I want to explain that. So has anybody like tried to install SAFe into an organization? Right? Okay. Anybody tried to install Scrum into an organization? Extreme programming? Okay. So those things I call systems of delivery. They're a way of operating. You might be able to make an argument that they're a system of transformation, but I believe they take a long time, and you have to stub your toe a lot if you use them as a system of transformation. I lump all of those methodologies into the broad category of system of delivery. And so a system of transformation is, how are you going to get the organization to become the kind of company that can implement your system of delivery? Does that make sense? Is that a little too esoteric? Hope not, because that's what we're going to talk about for the next 40 minutes. Okay? So we're going to try to explore a system of transformation. And so what we did as of Agile 2018 last year is my branding team put together a framework to try to help me figure out how to tell this story. And if you look at it across the top, right, we have the idea of why, what, how, and who. And then we have some topical areas that I think need to be addressed. And what I'm going to do, because this is an abbreviated talk, is I'm going to talk a little bit about the kinds of things that I think that you need to take into consideration when you're designing your own system of transformation. And then I'm going to talk through some key concepts that might not be super intuitive to you guys as Agilists, that I think are absolutely necessary to create momentum and to sustain change. Okay? And so the first bubble that I have up there is this idea of business case. Now, is anybody here adopting Agile for the sake of adopting Agile, just because it's the cool thing to do? Anybody? Right? No, right? Well, so in all fairness, right, sometimes there is a legit thing, like we need to be able to be Agile because none of the kids coming out of college want to work in Waterfall. Or I can't get talent to come work for me because we're doing COBOL mainframe stuff in Waterfall, right? That kind of a thing. Right? So there is an element of sometimes I need it, but even then it's not Agile for the sake of Agile. It's Agile because we're having a hard time recruiting the right kind of talent to come work for us. Okay? But usually when somebody calls us, and I didn't really much introduce myself, but Mike Cottmeyer, I'm the CEO of a company called Leading Agile. We're doing a lot of work in the Detroit, South Michigan area, but I'm based out of Atlanta, Georgia. And long history, we've been in business for about 9 years doing transformation. And when people call us, generally they're trying to solve one of 6 problems. And it's what I call predictability, quality, early return on investment, cost savings, innovation, or product fit. Most of the time, it's a CEO, it's like, I can't get my IT organization to make them meet commitments. They don't ever do anything they say they're going to do. They might do what they think they can do, but they're not doing what I want them to do. And that matters, right? We're putting crap in the market, right? Quality is really bad. It takes us 18 to 36 months to deliver anything, right? We're building the wrong product once we get it into market. We can't be innovative. We can't compete anymore. Those are the kinds of challenges. And so your fundamental thinking has to be, how is Agile going to help me solve that problem? Because if I have a business problem like predictability, I'm asking myself now, how is Scrum, or SAFe, or LESS, or DAD, or whatever, going to help me become more predictable? Okay? And that leads me into my second bullet. The second bullet is, okay, so let me go back to the first one. First one is know what business problem you're trying to solve. Because the business problem has to be big enough for the organization to make an investment in it. And whether you guys are using external consultants or whether you're using an internal team or whether you're sending people to training, money is being spent to solve a problem. And it's incumbent upon us as change agents, and I'm assuming you guys are all change agents with me because you're sitting on this talk, it's incumbent upon us to be able to prove to the organization that it's getting the business benefits associated with investing the dollars in the transformation. Okay? If we can't tie back to what the business cares about, then it's really difficult to make a business case for adopting Agile, right? A lot of times you walk into places and they've been doing things for multiple years and they've invested multiple millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars sometimes, and they just don't see the return. Okay, they don't see the gains that they hope for. So as change agents, anchor on the business case for why the organization wants to go Agile. And then what you've got to do after that is you've got to come up with a hypothesis for how Agile is going to create the business outcome. So if we believe that the problem is culture, how is changing the culture going to help us become more predictable? Like how is it going to? Sometimes what I'll do is I'll work with teams and I'll walk into a room and I'll ask a question, something to the effect of, okay, let's say we could wave a magic wand and remove the cultural barrier today. The question is what would we go do tomorrow? Do you guys know? If you could get everybody on board, what would you go do? What's the first thing you do tomorrow? Anybody want to be brave?
Play golf.
Play golf, yeah. So we get the whole organization convinced, we get all the spins set up, and we take the day off and go play golf. You need to have an answer to the question, right? So if we're going to run people through workshops that say things like, you need to be a more empowering leader and less command and control, and you need to make sure that you drive work and decisions out to the closest place to the people that are actually doing the work, how is that going to make me more predictable? Like how? What's the mechanism by which it's going to happen? You need to have an answer to that. If you are going to teach the entire organization Scrum, you need to have an answer to how is that going to happen. Scrum's answer to that question is actually rather simple, right? You just start doing Scrum. Scrum will show you the impediments, and then the Scrum Master works with the rest of the organization to remove the impediments, right? Simple, right? Until the impediment is beyond the scope of the team. Until you have a Scrum team that's sitting on top of a 50-year-old mainframe platform that's so tightly coupled that you can't change one thing without breaking 50 other things, right? How do you get to the definition of done at the end of the sprint? When you get to the end of the sprint and you run your retrospective and you find out that you have 50 external dependencies, how do you go make an improvement in order to be able to get more predictable? Right? It's interesting. Right? So we face so much resistance in the organizations we're working in. We're just like, man, if these people would just get it, then we'd be okay. But you're not, because you got to know what to go do after they go get it. After they get it, if you're going to teach them a methodology, you need to have an answer for how that methodology is going to help you overcome or achieve the predictability, quality, early return on investment, innovation, product fit type goals. Okay? And so you guys need to have a hypothesis. My core hypothesis, the thing that I think gets in the way of every single person that is trying to introduce Agile into a large organization, and it's the thing that creates the most cognitive dissonance with leaders and creates the most resistance from on high, are dependencies. Anybody have dependencies in their organization? Yeah. How does Scrum deal with dependencies? Nobody knows? Come on, somebody's got to be brave. Scrum deals with dependencies by encapsulating dependencies within the sphere of influence or the scope of the cross-functional team. So Scrum works best when the dependencies are encapsulated and can be resolved within the team. SAFe operates best when the dependencies can be encapsulated within the value stream, within the PI. Okay? Both of those methodologies break down when the dependencies extend beyond the team in the case of Scrum, or beyond the release train, value stream within SAFe. Okay? So dependencies are the things that get in the way of the best of our intentions. So the reason why empowering a team that's living in the presence of dependencies won't lead to predictability is because what that team will do is it will locally optimize for the things that it can control without fighting with anybody. Right? It'll do the best it can within its own little world. And it might go try to break some dependencies, but those other teams that it's trying to break dependencies with probably have other priorities. And breaking a dependency for you might not be the most important thing for them. So how does Team A define success when they're dependent upon Team B and Team B won't play? Right? It's a tough problem, isn't it? So this is why the culture answer is a weak answer. Because it's only the first hurdle. It's only the first step as far as getting people to try something new. Okay? What you've got to do is you've got to give them a credible plan for how they're going to break dependencies. If you're going to teach an organization practices, you've got to give them a credible plan for how those practices are going to resolve and ultimately break dependencies at scale. Okay? And one of the things that I like to say is that in the presence of dependencies, you have to manage them. Okay? If you don't manage dependencies, you are going to be the most unpredictable, sloppy organization in delivery ever. So you either manage dependencies or you break dependencies. Period. Okay? So quite often, Agile transformation is about getting the culture and the practices and the team-based structures and all that kind of stuff in place, and then managing the heck out of dependencies while you're trying to break them. So you manage them until you can break them. And like I said, Scrum does not give us a good, credible strategy for managing dependencies at scale. It only manages them within the team. And then SAFe is only giving us an answer, and I don't even think it's a great answer within the release train. Okay, how do you do cross-organization dependencies planning? Most methodologies that are trying to talk about dependencies are doing late resolution dependency management. Okay, they're not dealing with dependencies until they find them after the fact. And that's usually too late, and that will increase instability in your delivery pipeline. Okay? So what I want to encourage you guys to do is to get really super clear on what it is that you're doing and how that's going to help you advance your agenda and go back to the executives and be able to prove to them that this Agile stuff is actually working for them. Okay? Now, transfer theory and approach here. My core belief, and I've already talked about it a little bit, is that adopting Agile is really about forming complete cross-functional teams, giving those teams super clear backlogs, and getting them into a position where they can produce a working tested increment of product at the end of every sprint. Dependencies are going to get in the way of that. It's going to get in the way of your team getting to a definition of done at the end of the sprint. The inability to create a backlog is going to make your teams have unstable velocity. Okay? So forming teams, building backlogs, producing working tested software, and breaking dependencies over time is the approach we want. In the presence of dependencies, we put in compensating controls to be able to deal with dependencies, and you deprecate those compensating controls as you break them. You guys tracking with me? A little bit? Okay, hitting it at a super high level because I'm going to go super deep into like one or two concepts as we go into this. How are we doing on time? What do we start at 1? 20 minutes is gone already? Gosh, it's exhausting, right? Okay, so one of the things I want to encourage you guys to think about is if you are implementing Scrum or SAFe or what have you, the core patterns of those methodologies are what matters, right? So things like teams, things like backlogs, things like working tested software, things like collaborative cross-functional units, those are things that I consider like the reference architecture. Don't get super hung up on the practices. It's probably sacrilege, but we'll go in some places, and some places don't need Scrum Masters. Right? That'd be awful. No Scrum Masters. How can you do Scrum without Scrum Masters? Well, maybe you can't, right? But I don't necessarily need Scrum Masters in order to be able to be Agile. What I might need is a really good, strong team that knows how to work together and can coordinate work themselves, right? That works in a lot of places. Right? So distinguish between the base patterns that are necessary to make the organization agile from the methodology. You know, one of the things is we try to articulate our system of transformation for clients. One of the things that I really struggle with is like, and I'm sure Dean and Ken Schwaber and all these guys, they struggle with it too. It's like if you just give people loose principle-based guidance, they don't know what to show up to work to do. But then if you give them really prescriptive guidance, they think you've written Holy Scripture and that's the only way you can do it, right? And the truth's always in the middle, right? We have to understand the patterns of agility. We use the methodologies that have been documented for us as patterns, right? Things that we can leverage. But then we have to understand how to tailor those methodologies into our world, okay? So just recap since I'm halfway through my bubbles here. Need to have a business case, need to have a hypothesis for the kinds of changes that you're going to make. How are they going to actually impact the business case? Not, I train on Agile and I'm pretty sure it's going to give me good results. But it's like, I'm going to can't talk today. I'm going to train on this methodology. I'm going to break these dependencies over time. And then the encapsulation of the teams and the minimal orchestration across teams is going to allow those teams to operate with autonomy. Right? You guys have to have a mental model for that. That's what I'm calling a transformation hypothesis. You have to have an approach for doing that. How are you going to form teams? Where are backlogs going to come from? How are you going to get working tested software produced? What are we going to do with dependencies in the near term while we're trying to break them? We're not going to get married to specific methodologies. We're going to use methodologies as tools as they were intended, and we're going to focus on the core reference architectural kinds of things. And I don't mean values and principles like in the manifesto, although that's part of it. But I am talking about what are the core patterns up underneath these methodologies that are immutable. For me, that's teams, backlogs, working tested software, if anybody's ever heard me do that talk, right? Talked a little bit about it here. But teams, backlogs, working tested software, break dependencies wherever you can. Okay? And if you guys focus on those things, what you can start to do is you can start to put together a plan for how you're going to engage the organization. And that's where the change management stuff comes in. And one of the things that we talk about, I'm going to go a little bit deeper into this in second half of the talk, is how do you orchestrate, what does an organization look like as you're moving it from point A to point B? Does anybody believe that you could actually plan out an Agile transformation in a Gantt chart? You can. You can. Telling you, you can. If you know what you're doing, right? The unit of value in an Agile transformation is a transformed organization. A transformed organization goes through a fairly well-established set of states as it transforms from a non-Agile organization into an Agile organization. What we found across a whole lot of different clients is that you can actually script it. Okay? And it's not go train all these people on Agile and go find a bunch of Scrum Masters and get people doing Agile things. It's how are you going to form teams? Where are backlogs going to come from? How are we coordinating dependencies? At what point are we going to stabilize velocity? Which dependencies are we going to break and when? How are we going to reduce batch size organizationally? How are we going to start to deliver value and market more efficiently? Right? How are we going to start to measure the value that we're putting in market more efficiently? Right? Those are things that are knowable and they're plannable. Okay? But we have kind of this fetish towards emergence in the Agile community, and we want to pretend like we don't know anything. And so sometimes we let this desire to let things emerge get in the way of the fact that we actually know a little bit about how to do this stuff. Okay? The sixth bullet is results management. One of the biggest keys, and we did this out of necessity as a consultancy, is that we started to do, just a quick little bit of history on me. Leading Agile is about 110 people. We're fast growing. I could probably hire 30 people. Go see Rachel Howard out in the hallway if you guys are looking for a job. Anybody who's not working with us already, go have that conversation. Just kidding. But the idea is that as the deals got bigger, and they started getting approved at higher levels of the organization, the C-suite wanted to know what value they were getting for their money. And we had to start to prove the value of the transformation. Can anybody in this room quantifiably demonstrate to their CFO how the dollars spent on their transformation are leading towards very quantifiable business results on the backside? That's a tough problem. There's probably a few in here that could.
I was saying I struggle with that all the time.
We struggle with it, right? But we have to do it, right? And there's a funny comic I wrote a blog about a while ago, and some of you guys will probably remember it, but it's like two scientists sitting at a blackboard, and there's a bunch of math on this side of the blackboard, and there's a bunch of math on that side of the blackboard, and they have a cloud in the middle, and it says, a miracle happens here, right? You see that one? And the one scientist goes, I think you need to be more specific in step 2. I think that was kind of funny, right? So the idea is we want to be more specific in step 2, right? And so kind of the end game of these first 6 bullets is that the stuff that you do at the end, the stuff that you measure to demonstrably show to your customer, your internal customer, that the transformation is working, has to tie back to that original business case. In my opinion, it's non-negotiable. From a consultant's point of view, it's non-negotiable. I would suspect that for many of you guys in large organizations, it's non-negotiable. If we don't do that, then we're saying, give me a bunch of money, let me teach people Agile, and we're hoping for the best. Okay? And we need to be more specific in step 2. Now, the third part, and then I'm going to try to pivot here really quick, or the last part, I guess the 7th bullet, is roles and responsibilities, right? If you guys come, I'm doing a talk in a couple hours with Rachel, and we're going to talk about Agile hiring and skills and attributes associated with Agile teams and the kinds of things that we look for when we're hiring coaches or team members, that kind of thing. And it blows me away. The different personality types and how they impact behaviors and things like that. So understanding how people are going to perform in an organization and the mix of skill sets that you need in order to be able to pull this off is huge. Okay? And then finally, the idea of skills and experiences, like what kind of background and stuff. So these 8 bullets for me are the elements of a system of transformation. And again, we only have 45 minutes and it's a gigantic topic, but what I want to encourage you guys to do is as you go back into your organizations, really think through how you're solving for these things. What is it here? I'll give you guys a picture so like we'll show up all at one time if anybody's taking pictures of it. Think through all of these things. What is your business case? The actions that you're going to take, how are they going to advance your cause? What is it that you're actually trying to do, right? What problems are you trying to solve? Is it teams, backlogs, working tested software, and dependencies? Or is it something else? Are we getting overly fixated on methodology and forgetting the patterns that are necessary to be able to do this? Are we being attentive to the change management aspects of it? Can we measure results? And do we know that we have the right mix of people with the right skills and experiences to actually pull this off? One of the big common failure modes, and I understand why people do it, but they get somebody with a CSM certification and say they're going to be our change agent. And one of the things that we find, it's like the biggest differentiator, there's a lot of people that know how to do Agile stuff. There's a much smaller subset of people that can actually lead change and get people to think differently. Right? It's a different skill set. It's actually a different, we call it people DNA. Right? It's a different people DNA. It's a different behavioral profile. Right? It's fascinating, right? And so we'll talk a little bit about the science of that in the next talk that I'm doing. If you want the long form of this, we actually did a white paper. Tim can send you videos and links to other full form talks of this. But as we go into this, I wanted to go just a little bit deeper into theory and approach and see if you guys can track with me a little bit of what it is that we're talking about. A couple years ago, gosh, maybe 6 or 7 years ago now, I started writing about different organizations with like different attributes. And we came up with this little thing we call the 4 quadrants. And on the left hand, or on the horizontal axis, we talked about predictability versus adaptability. Organizations that are built to make and meet commitments versus organizations that are willing to respond to change or able to respond to change. Markets that are emergent, like it's okay to figure out where you're going as you go, versus organizations that are really struggling to deliver against fixed time, cost, and scope contracts. Okay? And what I was hypothesizing at the time is that there were basically 4 fundamental things. And I took a bunch of slides out here, so I'm just going to voice over this a little bit. But the upper left quadrant was the quadrant of chaos. It was the quadrant where I'm trying to be predictable, but things are changing. The lower left quadrant was the quadrant of the traditional SDLC. I'm striving for predictability. I'm trying to fix time, cost, and scope. The lower right quadrant was the quadrant of Agile. I'm trying to be predictable, but I'm trying to deliver in small batches, so I create options for change. And then the upper right quadrant was the quadrant of the lean startup. I am total experimentation. One of the big problems that we have organizationally is couplefold, is that as Agilists, we get enamored with the ideal state. Everybody needs to be lean startup. I'm sorry, but you're working for a government agency that's trying to build software for a defense contractor against an RFP. Right? That's just not a lean startup kind of environment. Right? And I would suggest that even even if you could implement it, right, it's just not going to converge necessarily on the right outcome. Okay? So the first kind of acknowledgement is that there's different flavors of Agile given different needs of different organizations in different markets. I would also suggest that there are different forms of Agile in place or out there in the market to compensate for different types of organizational dysfunctions. We walk into a lot of organizations that desperately need to be a lean startup. But their platform their product is built on a platform that's 50-year-old COBOL mainframe stuff. Right? Banking industry is struggling with this right now. Right? I mean, because a lot of these legacy banks, they've been using technology since the 60s. And a lot of that technology is still there running your ACH transactions. So how do I compete with a pure play mobile bank that's doing everything in distributed systems in the cloud, mobile, and I can do mobile, I can do cloud, but I'm anchored into this legacy mainframe. Right? That's a tough problem to solve for a lot of organizations. So sometimes even if we want to be, even if we need to be a lean startup, there are things in our ecosystem that are preventing us from being able to do that. Which is another thing, right? When we say, okay, well, you just need to have a more adaptive culture. You need to be less command and control. And I'm dealing with an architect or a manager that's been around for 40 years, and I'm like, yeah, but how's this going to deal with all these dependencies and this tightly coupled architecture I've got on the backside, right? It's just not going to solve the problem, right? So what we did is we kind of articulated this strategy, and it was the starting place for a conversation for us. And what we hypothesized, and it has actually become a very effective tool from us, was that you could use these quadrants to chart a course from low encapsulation, high orchestration to high encapsulation, low orchestration. All I'm basically saying is that if you have dependencies, you have to manage them, right? A highly encapsulated team is one with few dependencies and it requires less coordination. A team that has high dependencies, has low encapsulation, and requires more orchestration, okay? So what we're going from is highly coordinated systems to less coordinated systems. The only way to go from highly coordinated systems to less coordinated systems is to break the dependencies between those systems, okay? And so generally what we do is that we will come in and we'll say, okay, in the early stages, in the presence of dependencies, and I challenge you guys to do this too, is to create a lightweight coordination mechanism to be able to deal with the dependencies in real time. Not after the fact, not once we discover them, but proactively. Typically 3 to 6 sprints ahead of time at a minimum. You say, but Mike, that's big upfront planning. Well, that's because you got dependencies, right? And that's a huge myth, and it's a failure mode I see all the time. Well, Agile says that we don't have to manage dependencies. Well, it's because Agile assumes that you don't have any. If you actually have them, it's irresponsible not to manage them. Well, Scrum doesn't tell me how to do that. Don't know what to tell you. SAFe doesn't tell me how to do it across release trains. Don't know what to tell you. You better figure it out. Okay? So I'm just here stating if you have dependencies, you better have a mechanism in place to manage them. And so here's kind of an interesting story for me. So as this is all emerging, right? We're thinking about it. It's up on my whiteboard. We're talking to our teams. Teams are out working with clients. It's a pretty powerful tool for having this conversation. And what I started talking about was this idea. I called it outcomes-based planning. Like, what would be the 10 steps required to get from Basecamp 1 to Basecamp 2? That's what we call these steps in our world, right? And to me, it was like super obvious. To go from Basecamp 1 to Basecamp 2, we're going to stabilize the system, we're going to reduce batch size, we've got to form teams, we've got to do this, we've got to stabilize backlogs, we've got to break dependencies, boom, boom, boom. It was very wash, rinse, repeat to me. And what was fascinating is that we were actually in parallel. This is kind of an aside, but we were building a tool internally to manage some of this stuff, and we had an early cut of it, and I sent it out to my team leads, and I said, okay, put your outcomes into the tool. And they came back, and it was, oh my gosh, it was like a total mess, right? And it was like nobody understood what I was talking about. So it was very ad hoc, and each of my teams were doing things differently, getting it from Basecamp 1 to Basecamp 2. And so Dennis Stevens and I, Dennis is my chief methodologist, if you've never heard of him, really smart guy. We sat in front of the whiteboard, and for a couple days we collaborated, and we said, okay, what would it take for most organizations to go from the need to get predictable to the need to reduce batch size? From operating with small batches to operating as cross-functional teams with no dependencies. From operating as cross-functional teams with no dependencies in a really tightly coordinated product portfolio to a team-based funding model. To go from a team-based funding model to more of a lean startup-based funding model, right? And so we hypothesized about 8 to 12 steps to go from each of these different base camps, right? And what we kind of found is that most organizations were kind of the same, okay? So that Gantt chart that I made reference to earlier was really a standard like step 1, go to Basecamp 1, go through these intermediate states in the system. And you could find that a lot of the standard activities were the same too, right? As long as they tracked towards similar outcomes. And one of the things that it kind of helped us do, especially in large-scale transformations, in small transformations, this stuff isn't super important. We were working with a bank out in Omaha, and one of the challenges that we had is we had 11 consultants on the ground at the time, and the client was getting frustrated with this because all 11 of my consultants were saying something different. Right? They were doing things slightly different. And I would argue that they were doing things appropriately different. Okay? But when you're doing large-scale transformation and you're trying to create safety in the system, kind of teaching people the same stuff and operating off of a similar playbook is kind of important. Okay? So what we started to do, right, is we started to kind of emerge a standard playbook for the kinds of things that most organizations would need to do to get to Basecamp 1, to get to Basecamp 2, to get to Basecamp 3, to get to Basecamp 4, to get to Basecamp 5, standard activities, standard teaching, standard job aids. Now, every team, as they become more autonomous, can start to deprecate some of those compensating controls and just start to do things their own way. But while you're trying to untangle it, developing a methodology and some commonality around the kinds of things that we're going to do creates safety for those middle managers so they can breathe a little bit, right? And so you're giving them you're basically taking away one set of controls and you're giving them a different set of controls, right? And that's an okay set of controls, right? Because we want the managers to be able to control, are we getting to complete cross-functional teams? Are we getting to stable backlogs? Are we getting the teams to a stable velocity? What dependencies need to be broken so these teams can operate autonomously? What organizational impediments need to be removed so that we can deliver into market faster? Okay? And so what I'm suggesting to you is that what's starting to emerge out of this way of thinking is this notional idea that you can identify the system of delivery that you desire. And I have zero care what system of delivery anybody wants to do. Discipline, Agile delivery, SAFe, LESS, Scrum, Nexus, like whatever, right? It doesn't matter. Because they're all fine as long as you have the right ecosystem and from which them to operate, right? So what you've got to kind of figure out is, where am I going? What is the methodology? What are the characteristics of the methodology I want to have? What is the ecosystem necessary in order to be able to use that methodology? What are the gaps between the ecosystem I have now and the ecosystem I want? And then create this outcomes-based plan, this playbook, so that you can get everybody on the same page about the direction that you're trying to go. Right? And I know this is super high level and maybe I'm making some people's heads swim, but as Agilists, I don't think we feel like we have permission to do this. Right? Because all we can talk about sometimes is well, we're going to build a backlog and we're going to train people and we're going to do this, and right, the teams are going to figure it out and they're going to be empowered and it's going to emerge, and then everything within the organization comes crashing down on them and none of that stuff happens. Right? So what we have to do is we have to create a framework so that people can safely change, so that people can safely let go. And this is going to sound super heavy, but some of the stuff that we're doing in the change model, I'm not super happy with these slides anymore. I'm probably going to try to rebuild some of them for Agile 2019 this year. But we started talking about this idea of you build a leadership coalition. Some of this stuff is just straight out of John Cotter, right? Define an in-state vision. It's okay to look at the organization and say, this is how I want to operate, this is my hypothesis for what it needs to look like, and this is my plan for how to get there. I think that's responsible. I think it aligns people, right? We can say we're going here, right? We're not figuring it out as we go most of the time. Build a roadmap for how to get there. Maintain a rolling 90-day plan. We started to do release planning, right? Straight out release planning around the transformation items in the backlog. But that only works if you recognize that transformation is incremental and iterative, and the increments are organizations, groups of teams, and the iterations are the teams moving through progressive states of maturity and encapsulation. Okay, that's the only way it works, right? When you start to think about it that way, the backlog metaphor really starts to hold. Where the backlog metaphor breaks down is when we fill the backlog with need to train people on how to do Scrum. Need to run people through SPC training class. Right? That's all fine stuff to do, but that's not your backlog. It's the difference between a task and a user story. Train people, sure. But the user story is teams are formed. The user story is the teams have a stable velocity. Because if the teams don't have a stable velocity, you will never achieve predictability. You'll probably never achieve quality. You'll never achieve getting things into market faster. It just doesn't work, right? At scale in high complex environments. do 30-day checkpoints, sprint planning, right? And that the whole time we are being accountable to our economic stakeholders. And I use that word very carefully, to our economic stakeholders. Not to the people who are necessarily funding the transformation, but the people behind them that are providing the money that want the business benefit from the Agile transformation. Right? Being able to connect activity to outcome, being able to connect outcomes to business objectives. Receiving feedback, managing communication, creating safety for everyone to change, right? And so a lot of this, and remember what I said in the first part of the talk, a lot of this is about, it's not about what is the fastest, quickest, if people would just get their head out of their rear ends and just do it, it would be so easy, why are you making my life so hard kind of stuff. This is like real human beings with real hopes, real fears, real challenges, kids in college, mortgages to pay, right? All kinds of stuff that legit are scared to do this. And so it's up to us as change agents to take a responsible approach and realize that a lot of this stuff can actually be planned if we sit down and we think it through and we realize what's really important.